Hello, and welcome to Security in Context. I'm Anita Fuentes, and today I'm speaking with Anatol Lieven, Director of the Eurasia Program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. He was formerly a professor at Georgetown University in Qatar and in the War Studies Department of King's College London. And we are discussing the recent German elections and the broader geopolitical implications, as well as the newly announced US Ukraine minerals deal, the rift between Trump and Zelensky, and the risks of megaphone diplomacy in the ongoing war in Ukraine, topics that our guest has analyzed extensively in his recent articles for Responsible Statecraft. Anatol, thank you so much for joining me today.
Pleasure.
So comes my first question. You described Germany's current political trajectory as following France's, with mainstream parties forming coalitions to block so called populists. How sustainable do you think this strategy is, and what are the long term consequences for European democracy?
I don't think it is sustainable for very long. That's why I made the parallel to France, because, in two elections, Macron won and defeated Le Pen basically by ingesting all the centre right and centre left parties behind him. But he failed, not by any means always through his own fault. I mean, the problem is that Europe is now in a very difficult economic situation, and nobody has really clear ideas about what to do. Least of all, what to do while preserving Europe's social welfare systems. But anyway, I mean, if you put all the centre parties together and then you fail, there's nowhere really for people to go except to the extremes, and so you see a bigger vote for the further left. In France, it's La France Insoumise, but more, considerably more, of course, for the populist right. And then when you have other things feeding in, obviously migration, which is causing increasing anxiety all over Europe, but also, a worries that the establishments are dragging countries towards war in Ukraine, which most of the populations reject. It's obvious enough why people, do move to anti-establishment parties. Germany is a number of years behind France. I mean, only a few years ago, I'd have said a generation behind France, but things are, of course, moving pretty quickly. But if you look at the fact that this victory in these elections was won by the Christian Democrats with the second worst results in their entire history in terms of votes. The worst results were last time. And the Social Democrats got the worst result in their entire history since the 1880s, when Bismarck was ruling Germany and sat on them. It's clear enough the way things are going, I think.
Yeah, they're not going very well. um, But anyway, we have hope. You were mentioning immigration. So I wanted to ask you something related to this. The AFD's rise has been largely attributed to public concerns over immigration and over security. But you also highlight that the role of economic stagnation is also important. So to what extent do you think economic precarity is the primary driver of AFD's growing support, or is it not?
Well, I think it's both. Obviously, immigration is much easier for people to accept if there are enough good jobs going around, and also if people are secure in their jobs. Um, because it's all very well, and of course in the long run quite true to say that Europe's population is declining, and therefore we need more people, but that isn't going to comfort immediately a worker at Volkswagen who has lost his job. And isn't thinking about what Germany will look like in a generation's time. He's looking about what job he can get now and who is competing with him for it. And if the person competing with him and also competing for, housing perhaps, and, in the line for healthcare is a recent immigrant, well, the two things are going to flow together. I mean, the other thing is that, Japan has been pretty economically stagnant for more than a generation now, but with very low levels of migration, though it's growing, and very low levels of, therefore tension or, move in an extreme rightist direction. And I think what that does, indicate is that, and I think this is where the whole neoliberal project went terribly wrong. That people, are not necessarily addicted when it comes down to it. Certainly not people with children, to constantly increasing living standards and, increasing wealth and so forth, because, so many philosophers and religious people have pointed out at a certain point it becomes pointless. People don't need more clothes that, that they'll throw away tomorrow. There's a limit to, how much your ordinary person actually needs more electronic gadgets and so forth. But of course, what people do need is security. And if you have job insecurity, if, of course, as we see in so many countries, you have housing insecurity, people are young people can no longer afford to buy, so they're renting, and then that raises the question: what happens if, if the rents go up or your income goes down? School systems all over the place are in crisis. University fees are increasingly unaffordable. So, I think you have we need some rather deep thinking about this balance between economic growth and economic and, and social security.
Right. In your article about the German election, you also mentioned that Germany's two dominant parties, the CDU and the SPD, are aligned in their hostility toward Russia, despite the economic incentives for resuming gas imports. So, to what extent does this position, in your opinion, reflect ideological commitments, and how much is it dictated by Germany's broader geopolitical dependencies?
Well, Germany, like a number of European countries, is in a very, very strange position because, the German establishments over the past generation and more went along with very limited divergence or pushback with with US agendas, because of course they've been gradually just schooled and disciplined in this throughout the Cold War, and now to their absolute horror and astonishment, they find that the US is no longer committed to them in the same way and has a quite different agenda. I mean, Trump has in some ways turned on a dime as far as the Ukraine war is concerned. And so, but on the other hand, they do retain some kind of national and personal pride, and it's very difficult for them simply to salute and obey and follow. But also, of course, over time, and once again, I mean, the tragicomic thing is that this was very much the work of the transatlantic, security establishment. The politicians, the media, but not necessarily nearly so much of the public, have been schooled in this fear of Russia, which of course also comes out of the fact that all these institutions originated in the Cold War. So, they fall back on fear of Moscow as a kind of default mode. But the thing is, that If you're an ordinary person in France or Germany, I was in Paris last year, and I was talking to this guy from this think tank, and he was saying, but you have to understand that in reality, in effect, we're already at war with Russia. And I looked around the Place de Victoire with the shoppers and the people in the cafes. And I said, no, we're not, No, we're not. If we were at war with Russia, this scene would look very, very, very different. And of course, Starmer of Britain made this speech last week to Parliament saying that Russia is a menace on our streets, on the streets of Britain, because, there have been a couple of Russian assassinations of Russian defectors, which, of course, regrettably, is something that the Indians did in Canada last year, and quite a number of countries, look at Saudi Arabia, have made a habit of that. But of course, the point is, look at the news from Germany today. If Germans now go to a market, or some crowded event, they're not worried that Russian soldiers will suddenly appear and start shooting them. They're worried that some maniac, either of the Islamists or of the extreme right, will drive a car or a truck into the crowd and kill them and their children. That's what they're worried about. And you simply cannot convince ordinary people, that a war going on, almost 1,000 miles away, presents the same threat to them. They just, in the end, will not buy it. And, there's a limited extent to which you can persuade them to buy it.
Right. And there's almost more agitation with regard to the genocide in Palestine within Germany than about Russia itself in terms of seeing it in the day to day lives of people.
Well, the point is, of course, that, and I've been in Ukraine, the level of destruction and civilian death in Gaza is just much, much worse. And look, I don't approve myself of throwing this term, genocide around, because it's been used far, far too widely. But the thing is, when Putin says that, the Ukrainians and Russians are one people or closely linked people and they ought to be friends, that is really not what Hitler said about the Jews, or the Hutus said about the Tutsis in Rwanda. But it is, but if you look at what some of the Israeli extremists have been saying about the Palestinians, animals who should be exterminated, or they must be, driven out, there can never be peace between our peoples. Well, that sounds, a lot more like genocidal language. But above all, of course, you've got an awful lot of Muslims in Europe now. And, when they see utterly different standards being applied to human rights abuses against Christian whites and against Muslims, totally, totally different. When they see, the United States uh, obsessed about Israeli American hostages, but not even noticing, not even commenting when Palestinian American citizens are killed. Well, what conclusion are you supposed to draw, for God's sake? Of course they see this as racist. And of course they think that the countries of which they are citizens and of which we're all hoping, to integrate them and turn them into loyal citizens, they get the feeling that these countries don't care about them. Well, that's extremely dangerous for the future of Europe. And the answer, of course, is not, Islamophobia or racism or whatever. It is a consistent ethical policy.
Yeah. Caring for people, which is something that the institutions are failing to do. Um, You also discuss, going back to your article about the German election, how Trump administration policies have amplified Germany's security anxieties, leading to calls for greater European defense autonomy. And you also kind of already mentioned this, but how realistic is the prospect of an independent European security framework?
Well, I think they're going to do their best, but and I mean, if you're talking about deterring a Russian invasion of the Baltic states or Poland, you don't actually need that much money. Look at what the Ukrainians have achieved with drones. Masses of cheap drones, landmines. Yes, I mean artillery pieces with enough shells to fire them. But tanks have proved almost useless on both sides because as soon as they appear in the front line, they're knocked out by drones. Now, of course, you need soldiers who are prepared to fight, but the Poles are certainly prepared to fight with enough backup, at least from Britain and France. Um, but if you're talking about, and that's entirely within our capability, but if you're talking about, a European arms industry that can somehow, substitute for US arms in Europe, well, as everybody says, the key point there is not more money, it is integration. But what that means, of course, is that you sit down together and you look, for example, at your main battle tanks and you say, well, basically there are three chief ones, probably others I can't remember, but there's the German Leopard, there's the French Leclerc, and there is the British one, Challenger, I think it's called. I can't remember. And you have an objective panel which looks at them, and it says, well, the Leclerc's pretty good, but the Leopard is better, and basically the Challenger is crap. So no more British and French tanks. You basically, okay, so maybe the Germans will agree to produce some of them in your countries, but most of it will come from Germany. So there's a really big hit to your the technological vehicle production. Not easy. And of course, that's true across the board. It's true of shipbuilding, it's true of aircraft production. So, I mean, not easy. But on the other hand, you see, it's also to a degree not necessary because all the European governments have said they won't fight, they will not go to war with Russia in Ukraine. Now, they're talking about this, European force for Ukraine, but then they immediately come out and say, "Oh, but only if we have an American backstop, only if the Americans promise to come and rescue us if there's trouble." Well, Trump has said repeatedly, "I will not do that. It's not going to happen." So, if you're talking about defending, not trying to win the war for Ukraine, but if you're talking about defending NATO and the European Union within their existing borders, well, there isn't actually any serious evidence that Putin has the slightest intention of attacking us. He says he hasn't again and again, but if you actually sit down in a sober way and think of the advantages that Russia would gain from that compared to the risks, it's perfectly obvious why they wouldn't do that. I mean, as everybody says, the Russians do have a particular obsession about Ukraine. I'm not saying it's correct, but yeah, for a whole set of reasons which any expert should know. Yes, I mean, the Russians do have an obsession with Ukraine, but they don't have an obsession with Poland or the Balts or Romania in that way. And so much of the Western writing about this is based simply on assumptions. I mean, I challenged one European think tank person who had written that, the Russian government has made innumerable threats to attack the Baltic states. And I said, well, can you quote them? And all she could come up with was, of course, cyber attacks, sure. But I mean, that's going on all over the place now. And the fact that they'd moved some maritime buoys around for a few meters. And that was it. So all these supposedly innumerable threats turned out simply not to be there. So the point is that actually we can defend ourselves pretty adequately. But of course, if we decide actually to deliberately to go to war with Russia in Ukraine, that's a very different matter.
In your latest article, you talk about, well, you critique both Trump and Zelensky for engaging in what you call megaphone diplomacy. Could you expand on this idea, also based on recent developments and what you see as the risks of this kind of public confrontation, and how do you see this whole situation between Trump and Zelensky, fitting into the larger geopolitical picture, and what the implications you think will be?
Well, I think the point is that Zelensky for years, I mean, certainly since the Russian invasion, and the Ukrainians have been engaging in megaphone diplomacy. I mean, the Ukrainian ambassador to Germany, what was his name? Would talk in public, attacking the German government for cowardice. Saying in public to the media that Germans were scared of Russia and that they were betraying European democracy and values and so forth. And the German government sat there saying, "Yes, yes, we're terribly sorry. Yes, yes, well," and but that that even worked with Biden, and of course partly because Biden and all the others were also engaging in megaphone diplomacy, shouting and shouting about Russian evil. But it doesn't work with Trump. Trump really does not like being pressured in public. And so, Zelensky, and I think Zelensky was terribly briefed from that point of view. He clearly had not been told what Trump's character is like. And, for heaven's sake, I said this, it was rather timely, if I may say so, in an article 2 days before that meeting, saying, for God's sake, everybody should quieten down in public. Stop digging yourselves into positions that you may have to, come out of again. And above all, stop ratcheting up the public hysteria. But, I mean, of course, that said, Trump and Vance, it was totally wrong to reply in this harsh and bullying fashion in public. I mean, Trump should have called this press conference to an end, well, halfway through, basically, as soon as it looked as if it was getting contentious. But above all, this should never have been a press conference. You don't, given that this minerals deal was not, in fact, even wholly certain yet. You don't hold a press conference then. You just, the two of them sit together. It's not a press conference, it's a photo opportunity. And they both say, Zelensky says, which he should have done, how deeply grateful we are for US, support all these years, and Trump says, and how deeply we respect the tremendous courage and resilience of Ukraine and its glorious soldiers. And cameras, journalists go out, and then Zelensky says, but that you've got to help us. The Russians are killing us, and that they're going to go on and conquer Europe and threaten you. And Trump basically says, "Oh, bullshit! Stop giving me this crap, and let's talk, serious details in private." In private, I mean, I don't know. I'm not a diplomat myself, and I have a personal reputation for being very undiplomatic. But I mean, really, I could conduct things better than this bunch.
I don't know if there's anything else you'd like to add before we wrap up. Perhaps some concluding remarks about the current situation, geopolitics. Where do you think we'll end up? Who knows?
Well, I mean, of course, one thing which you, by definition, cannot answer is what will happen on the battlefield. Because the Russians are advancing, but they're advancing very, very slowly. And with, the French foreign minister said yesterday that Russia is getting closer and closer to France's borders at the rate of a couple of 100 meters a day in East Ukrainian mining villages. I mean, honestly. But of course, there are two questions. I mean, one is, will the Ukrainians at some stage, in fact, collapse? Which they will do if the US completely pulls its aid. I mean, they could keep going. The talk in Ukraine is that they can keep going for 6 months with the weapons that they now have, but not for much longer. But the second thing is, what are the Russian calculations? And that we just don't know. Um, are the generals telling Putin just hang in there and we'll win a much greater victory? Or are they telling him, no, we'll go on grinding forward, but actually, 6 months from now, we'll actually look weaker than today because we will have made much less progress. I mean, I hope to God it's the latter, because I think it would be extremely stupid. I think it would be historically stupid of Putin to throw away this opportunity, for a genuine reconciliation with the United States in return for a few, ruined towns in eastern Ukraine. So I hope that the Russians will come back with a reasonable, counteroffer, and I hope that the Europeans and Ukrainians will stop trying to block this, which is what they're really doing with their, idea for a European force in Ukraine, because the Russians have said again and again and again, most recently 2 days ago, that is out of the question. They see that as equivalent to NATO. They won't accept it if Europe insists on that and the Americans go along with it, or the Ukrainians go along with it. There will be no deal, and the war will continue. And then, of course, well, I mean, there was one thing that Trump said, and, I'm not saying Trump is a sincere humanitarian, but he did say one thing that so many of these supposed, liberal humanitarians have completely forgotten, which is that, people are dying all the time in Ukraine. And it's also very obvious from, the massive attempts at evasion of service that an awful lot of young Ukrainian men don't want to die. Certainly not if, a reasonable deal can be achieved. And, the spectacle of Western hawks, urging on Ukrainians to die from Washington or Paris, or, of course, going to Ukraine and staying in an international hotel in Kiev and urging them on to die, is not what I think of as humanitarianism.
Well, Anatol Lieven, thank you so much for joining me today.